Good morning, everybody, and welcome to NECEC's Emerging Trend Series event, Opportunities for Hydrogen in the Northeast. I'm Peter Rothstein, the president of NECEC, which combines the Northeast Clean Energy Council and NECEC Institute. We are based in the Northeast US. We are focused on growing the clean energy industry in this region of the US and on helping to develop a model clean economy in the Northeast. Welcome to this event today on opportunities for hydrogen. As states in the Northeast are increasing their climate goals to be net zero by 2050, all of the states and the public-private collaborators are doing analysis to figure out how we may get to net zero and what the alternative scenarios may be. There are many reports that are revealing that even with growth in offshore wind, solar, long duration storage, and electrification of vehicles and some building heat, there will still be gaps in providing clean energy for both consumer and commercial transportation, and for some energy intensive industrial processes and building heating as well. With news that's coming in from around the world on the increasing feasibility of green hydrogen to be cost competitive with other zero carbon solutions, we're going to be asking the questions today about whether hydrogen technology is mature enough to help the Northeast reach its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, and look at many of the issues related to hydrogen business models and markets as well. NECEC is convening stakeholders in all aspects of the hydrogen industry to discuss these opportunities and challenges of developing the infrastructure for a green hydrogen economy. We're going to hear today from some industry leaders and researchers. We're going to be looking at case studies from some parts of the world and learning lessons about what is working and what progress is still needed. We're going to be talking about best practices and steps to build up a green hydrogen economy, both here in the US and also learning from what's going on in Europe. Throughout this session, you'll have some opportunities to ask questions of our speakers. There's a Q&A option on the bottom, when you move your mouse on the bottom of your screen. If you enter questions in there, those questions will be visible to any of the speakers for those times when we have time for some Q&A and feedback. So ask your questions at any time throughout this session. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And one more, thank you, the agenda. We have two major sections for today's event. The first one is going to be two keynote addresses to give us some of the context and background and depth about what is going on in the efforts to develop a hydrogen economy. And then that will inform a panel, which will move into greater detail. So to kick us off with the first of our two keynotes, I'd like to introduce Bart Biebuyk, who's the Executive Director for Fuel Cells and the Hydrogen Joint Undertaking, which is a public-private partnership aiming at facilitating the deployment of fuel cells and hydrogen technologies in Europe. Under his leadership, with a strong emphasis on cooperation with cities and regions, it's led to the creation of the European Hydrogen Valleys Partnership with around 40 European regions. Before the FCHJU, Bart was at the Fuel Cell Department of Toyota Motor Europe. His expertise in the automotive industry includes extensive knowledge related to the deployment of new technologies in the European market. And he's also had the opportunity to develop and expand his expertise in Japan, where for 2 years he worked in the development of Toyota and PSA's small vehicle. So Bart, if you want to join and turn your video and your audio on, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for the very kind introduction. And it's good for having me with your session here. I would like first to share my screen just to make sure. Voila. I hope you can all see my screen now. So today I will talk to you a little bit about the European Hydrogen Strategy and also the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. And before we go into that, very shortly, a little bit first about who is the FCHJU. Well, we are a public-private partnership with very clear focus on bringing products to market readiness by 2020. We have invested together, private and publicly, €2 billion in 263 projects so far. The private partners are Hydrogen Europe. It's an industry grouping, around 150 plus members. But also, on the other hand, the research grouping, which is 80 members. And then from the public member, we have the European Commission represented by the Directorates of Transport, Energy, and also research, of course. So we are working on energy, transport, and cross-cutting activities. Cross-cutting is more like standardization, safety education, so on. Last year, we have made a European hydrogen roadmap where we looked into 2030 and 2050, what could hydrogen bring to the European market. And we realized that by 2050, 24% of the European energy needs could be supplied through hydrogen. And then at the same time, we could reduce 560 million tons of CO2 annually, abatements, and then generate an annual revenue of 820 billion euros, while also reducing other emissions, but most important, also creating 5.4 million jobs in the European Union. And that led to the European Hydrogen Strategy, which was announced on the 8th of July 2020. And actually, this strategy has 3 phases. And the first phase is until 2024, where we will put 6 gigawatts of electrolyzers in the field, creating 1 million tons of renewable hydrogen, and mainly focusing on replacing existing hydrogen production, which is, let's be honest, mainly still gray. We will start regulation for liquid hydrogen markets and planning the hydrogen infrastructure. The second phase will run until 2030 then. There we will put 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers in the field, creating 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen. We will look into new applications like steel, but also transport, mainly heavy duty then. We will start to use hydrogen also for the electricity balancing purposes for the grid. Creation of more hydrogen valleys. As you know, in Northern Europe, Northern Netherlands, we have created the first European hydrogen valley. It's more or less like your Silicon Valley. And so the idea now is to make more of these hydrogen valleys across Europe, and at the end, connect them. And that's why we also have a need for a cross-border logistical infrastructure. The third phase is after 2030 until 2050, where we believe that the technology should be mature and ready to be deployed in hard-to-abate sectors like steel or other areas. Also, we will further work on synthetic fuels. We have to make sure that European-wide we have really an infrastructure network at place. And of course, it has to be an open international market. And all these 3 phases will actually be supported by the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. They have to make such a European investment agenda. The whole strategy has a full value chain approach, from investments to boosting demand, to putting the infrastructure in place, R&I, and of course, international dimension. On the investment agenda, Europe has already many different instruments to support investments. I mean, we'll have the next generation EU, but also we have Invest in EU, cohesion policies, and so on, as you can see. Because a lot of investments will be required. And you can see that actually in the area of renewable electricity production, we will have to invest up to 340 billion euro. In renewable hydrogen, up to 43 billion euro. In the transportation, means by gas pipelines, for example, 65 billion euro. And in the heavy duty transport, 13 billion euro, and in steel, 8 billion euro. And all of that will be supported by the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. The second part is, of course, if you invest so much, of course, you need to make sure there is demand. And for that, we will also have several instruments to foster the demand. Our main focus will be renewable hydrogen. However, we also know that in a transitional period, we need to support low carbon hydrogen. And in the first part, we will replace existing hydrogen production. We will look into fertilizers, but also in steel, in current buses or commercial fleets, heavy duty road vehicles, and also in the longer term, then maritime and aviation. How will we support the end consumers? Europe has 2 strategies on that. First one is a European strategy on clean steel, and the secondly is the sustainable and smart mobility strategy. In that strategy, for example, we oblige some of public authorities to have an X% of amount of zero emission vehicles in their fleet. Secondly, we need to create markets. We will do that through certification of this hydrogen, but also to put some quotas in specific end-use sectors, for example. Make sure that there is, of course, an infrastructure for hydrogen across all the consumers. And of course, it has to be an open and competitive hydrogen market. In terms of the supply and infrastructure, there, for the producers, we will mainly support them through a common low carbon threshold for hydrogen production facilities, the certification, as I explained already. In Europe, we have also an emission trading scheme, so we will revise that one. We are thinking very seriously about a carbon contract for differences. We will have to make a market-based support scheme for renewable hydrogen, and also liquid markets with commodity-based hydrogen trading. In terms of the infrastructure, that we have the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive. This will be revised next year, and there we will try to make sure that hydrogen will become mandatory for the member states to put in hydrogen refueling stations. We will have revised the 10E, as basically the Trans-European Network on Energy, and also the internal gas markets. This legislation will be changed, including hydrogen, and also we will have a revision of the 10-year plan for the infrastructure.
Bart, you're going in and out again. If you could just, your audio is going in and out a little bit.
Is it better now again?
Right now it's good.
Okay. All right. So the next one is the research and innovation part. So Europe has a certain global leadership role in Europe, and the idea is to keep that leadership role, but also to strengthen that role. And that will be done through the establishment of a new joint undertaking, which will be called Clean Hydrogen Partnership. This will be the successor of the FCH-JU. So from summer next year, we will change name. We will have other research and innovation projects in other parts of the Horizon Europe funding area. We will have the Innovation Fund. There will be also regional investment instruments, all to support R&I. We itself, in R&I, we will work on 4 main pillars. Will be on the hydrogen generation, but also large size. So more efficient and more cost-effective electrolyzers. We'll also look into new ways, low TRL, new ways of producing hydrogen, things about ALK or direct sunlight splitting and so on. Then we will also work on large-scale end-use applications for the industry, but also heavy-duty, and we will do pre-normative research as well. The third pillar is the infrastructure, so we will have to do research on, for example, how to refurbish current natural gas pipelines to be used in future with 100% hydrogen or even blended, and so on. And the last pillar is the cross-cutting, where we will support the policy through standardizations, but also looking into the total value chain, life cycle action, critical raw materials, and so on. Fifth is the international dimension. So Europe will make sure that in the bilateral or regional cooperation, hydrogen is put on the table. We have several instruments for that. We have the neighborhood investment platform. This is then with the countries around the EU 27. We have also association agreements for research where we will work with them. We will also look into hydrogen collaboration in the Africa-Europe Green Initiative, because we believe that we can—
Excuse me, Bart, it's happening again. Excuse me, Bart, sorry to interrupt. It was happening again, the garbling.
Okay, sorry for that. So in terms with Africa, Europe is believing that we can import a lot of green hydrogen from Africa through the pipelines to Europe. And as I said, we will make sure that hydrogen is in every discussions on the table in any diplomacy or whatever international event exists. In terms of the international markets, we have to make sure that we have common greenhouse gas emission reduction standards and criteria. We need to make sure that the green hydrogen in Europe is also the same way calculated in Australia or in the US or whatever. We want to have the benchmark for Europe to do transactions in hydrogen and facilitate an emergency of rule-based hydrogen market. We will participate in multilateral fora. We have the IPHC, Mission Innovation, the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial meeting, also the Clean Energy Ministerial, where they have now a hydrogen initiative. All these multilateral fora, Europe is really leading or co-leading actually them. So again, to put really hydrogen at the highest level of the agenda. Then we have the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. And what is the alliance? What is it? Well, it was also launched on the 8th of July. And this is really their mission is very simple: create a pipeline of projects for a massive rollout of this technology in Europe. And they have to involve all the stakeholders in this whole ecosystem. And for that, we will make 6 roundtables up from hydrogen production, transmission, mobility, industrial, energy, and residential. So each of them will have a roundtable chaired by a CEO of a company in that area, of course, together working with other CEOs. So this is really like a club of CEOs, but with the aim to communicate with the commissioners. So to make sure that if the investments are done, that also the legislative frameworks are okay for the CEOs to invest. So again, what's the mission of this hydrogen alliance? Really a pipeline of investment, make a very clear investment agenda, scaling up, this is a key point, fast, implement really the actions of this hydrogen strategy in Europe. And we estimate that all the investments that will be required will be around 430 billion euro by 2030. Who can join? Well, basically, industry, national, local public authorities, civil society, other stakeholders. And also this is across the whole hydrogen value chain, from renewables to production, usage, mobility, industry, and so on. And it's basically open to everybody who really wants to contribute to the objectives that we have set out in the declaration of the Alliance, which you can find on the internet. And finally, for us, last week, we have announced the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Observatory. Why did we do that? This will support us in showing how we progress in the applications or in the putting basically this technology in the field. It will be a lot of graphs and data show, how many vehicles, how many electrolyzer capacity, all these things will be shown. It will cover the technology and the market, but also policies and regulation, codes and standards, patents, funding, education, and training. So, and it will not only be about Europe, but also it has a global picture. So also the US, for example, will be included. The updates will not be so frequently as the European updates one, but we include basically a global picture. We want to give it a global picture and to show where also Europe is in that global picture. This is my last slide. We will have a European Hydrogen Week from the 23rd to the 27th of November. That means that during the full week, we will talk about hydrogen in research, but also in international cooperation. We will have top political speakers. From 4 commissioners will come to speak. And then at the end, we have also brokerage and investor pitching sessions. So if you want to hear more about the Hydrogen Week in Europe, please subscribe to our newsletter, and then you will for sure get the agenda. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bart. Really appreciate being able to see and understand much of the progress going on in Europe. There's an awful lot to learn from these efforts you're describing, and I think will obviously be coming back to this part of the discussion as we continue throughout the morning here. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to move us on to our second keynote speaker, Joseph Heiser, who's the Managing Principal with Energy Futures Initiative. Joe joined former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz and fellow principal Melanie Kenderdine in founding Energy Futures Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to driving innovation in energy technology, policy, and business models. He's the managing principal and lead executive on key EFI research projects that include reports looking at federal support for carbon dioxide removal research technologies, the US nuclear enterprise and its key role in national security, and white papers on DOE's budget priorities, federal tax incentives for energy innovation, and others. He's also currently a member of the advisory board of the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University, and having formerly served as CFO and senior advisor to the Secretary of Energy from 2013 through 2017. So Joe, take it away. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter, and good morning to everyone. Happy to speak to you today about issues surrounding hydrogen. So let me start off with the first slide. Peter has already kind of summarized this. I've been working now for the last several years with former Secretary Moniz, and my fellow principal, Melanie Kinderdine. And I believe that both of them may have, spoken to some of you about various issues related to decarbonization. Next slide, please. Our work is on decarbonization has had a large regional flavor to it. And so we've done major studies in California, we've done work on regional energy innovation, and we're currently doing several regional decarbonization studies, including a study of New England, which I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a moment. Next slide, please. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention about EFI is that last year, well, many of you know, members of Congress have proposed the Green New Deal, and that caused former Secretary Moniz then to speak about the need not for something that would meet the same principles and objectives of the Green New Deal, but do it in a way that is pragmatic and innovation-based that we called the Green Real Deal. I'm not going to talk about this slide, but I just wanted to show it to you because it kind of reflects the philosophy in which we approach all of our work. And you can read more about this on our website. So if you go to the next section, I'd like to talk for a moment about New England decarbonization. And this is a study that we're doing right now in cooperation with a firm called E3, which is an energy modeling firm that is based out of San Francisco. And this is work that is supported by Calpine Corporation. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because in thinking about hydrogen, at least historically, the connection had always been hydrogen and transportation, hydrogen and fuel cells. What I wanted to show you in some of these slides that follow is that in looking at the power sector, it's also very important to think about hydrogen as a necessary clean fuel for power generation. So just a little bit of motivation. The study we're doing right now that will be released probably within about a month is looking only at the 6 New England states, but not New York. Looking at how strategies for how those 6 states in that region could meet their decarbonization goals, most of which are 80%, but now gravitating toward a net zero commitment by mid-century. Next slide, please. So in our modeling work, we have developed 2 scenarios that we've been looking at. One is a high electrification scenario and one is a high fuel scenario. But as some of our modeling work has shown, the results show very little difference between the 2 scenarios. But basically, the work that we're doing shows that in terms of decarbonization, we can get to about 85% through emissions reductions. And then if one were to try and move beyond that to a goal of net zero, would have to do that through various carbon removal strategies or carbon offsets. Next slide, please. One of the key aspects of both of these modeling scenarios is the fact that whether it's high electrification or high fuels, the demand for electricity is going to increase substantially. In the high electrification scenario, it's almost a doubling. And in the case of the high fuel scenario, it's an increase of about 66%. So the electricity sector has a 2-part challenge. One is to decarbonize its generation while at the same time meeting a significant increase in demand. Next slide, please. The other aspect of our modeling work has shown that in the increase in electricity load, it begins to change the seasonal pattern of electricity use in New England. And so New England would shift from a summer peaking electricity market to one that is winter peaking by the year 2030, literally within the next decade. And obviously the main driver of that is the penetration of electrification in residential and commercial heating. The other aspect of it, if you look at the bar chart on the right, is that under both of the two scenarios that we are looking at, the peak load in the winter increases by anywhere between 42 to 51 gigawatts, which is roughly a doubling of what the current winter peak is in New England. So there's going to be an increased significant demand for clean electricity. And so how is that demand going to be met? And so let's look at the next slide. And on the next slide, it shows that under both scenarios, there's a broad mix of increased generation, clean generation, to meet that demand, with really three key elements. If you look at the color coding, the biggest one obviously is the development of the offshore wind industry. The second one is solar, both solar as utility scale as well as distributed solar. And the third one is imports of hydropower. In our modeling, we were not able to do a lot of modeling of hydrogen, but we do show some hydrogen, but we think that we've so far very much underestimated the potential there. And so if you look at the next slide, I think this really drives home the point about the need for a clean fuel in the electricity sector. The bars at the bottom of the chart show the pattern of generation to meet load over an annual period over the 4 seasons. And we took a typical winter week, and if you look at that, expanded that at the top of the slide. And what that shows is that when you look at the pattern of demand and the dispatch, you need to meet peak conditions. You still need to rely on fuels. And in particular, we're showing that the 32 gigawatts of natural gas that currently exists in the region is needed to be dispatched for reliability and to meet peak. And that's 32 gigawatts of capacity, but it is being dispatched in such a way that it has very low rates of capacity utilization. And so if that fuel can be substituted with a clean fuel, it can help very much in adding to the opportunity to decarbonize the sector, but also to further stabilize and improve the reliability of the grid by having an opportunity for even greater dispatch to meet load requirements. And so the reason I wanted to, if you go to the next slide then, the key takeaways from our modeling work to date, and we'll be documenting this in the report, as I said, that we will be releasing here in the next month, is that first of all, we're going to see a very substantial increase in demand for electricity, in clean electricity. Secondly, a large portion of that demand is going to be met by increased generation, particularly solar and offshore wind. But obviously, particularly with solar, a key issue is going to be land availability as a constraining factor. And for both of them, transmission availability will be a constraining factor. The third point, and this is the key point I think for hydrogen, is that even with these changes, which would be quite substantial, the region will still need somewhere between 30 plus gigawatts of thermal capacity, but at increasingly low capacity factors. And that's going to require some form of a low carbon fuel in order to reduce the carbon intensity of that generation. And then last point is that when you look across the portfolio mix, when the more cases that we've run that have more options available, produce lower costs to consumers and also lower technology risks. So optionality emerges as a very key element of any decarbonization strategy for the region. And that's really where we think that hydrogen can play an increasing role that we've really yet to fully explore. And so with that, let me transition briefly then into some other points that I wanted to make with respect to hydrogen and how it could play a role in the region's clean energy economy. So if you flip to the next slide, we think that obviously hydrogen can be produced in two ways, one from steam methane reforming and another way from hydrolysis. Let me just mention a couple of observations about each of those two production methods. First, hydrogen production from natural gas. One of the key things about the US, and this is data from a recent IEA study, is that we can produce in the US hydrogen from natural gas at very competitive costs relative to the global market. And so my colleague Bart Bibio talked about all the potential for hydrogen production in Europe. You can see here, because of our natural gas resource base, we could actually produce hydrogen from natural gas at lower costs than they can in Europe. And this is either with CCUS or without CCUS. And so there is an opportunity here for hydrogen production from natural gas, and to do it cleanly would require CCUS. But there's a big but here, and if you look at the next slide, you'll see it. And the big but is the following, and that is that if you produce hydrogen from natural gas with CCUS, you need an option in order to sequester the carbon that's captured. This map here on the left shows the map of potential geologic sequestration resources in the US. And as you can easily see from that chart, there are no geologic sequestration resources in New England, and you have to get all the ways either to Western New York State or to the northern tier of Pennsylvania in order to find adequate geologic disposal site. So opportunities to generate hydrogen from natural gas in New England is going to require pipeline infrastructure, either to move the CO2 to out of the region to a sequestration site, or to produce the hydrogen outside the region and to pipeline it into the region. The other option for generating hydrogen is shown on the next slide. And that slide shows production from hydrolysis as well as other alternatives. If you can go to the next slide, please. And this is a little bit of a busy chart, but again, this is also from the IEA comparative analysis looking at global costs and opportunities. And if you focus for the moment just on the green bars, the US, in terms of the ability to produce hydrogen from hydrolysis, is kind of like in the mid-range. We're still actually very competitive with Europe, obviously extremely competitive with Japan, but much less so from other regions, particularly Africa and India. And the reason for that, quite frankly, is just simply the cost of renewable electricity, particularly from solar and wind. But nonetheless, we can still potentially produce hydrogen at a cost of about $3 per kilogram. So the next slide shows what a hydrogen economy would begin to do in terms of job creation. And again, relative to other forms of fuel and power production, it is very competitive and can provide new jobs that are on a par with jobs in some of the existing energy industries, except for down at the bottom where you look at energy efficiency, where the number of jobs per dollars of invested are still much higher than anything on the generation side. Next slide, please. The point I want to make about industry. Um, hydrogen is often talked about as a potential alternative, as a clean source of fuel for high temperature process heat for industries that otherwise would have challenges in decarbonization. And here on, this is some work that EFI did several years ago, where on the right-hand side, you see the benefit of the tax credit for carbon capture and utilization, which would be the primary alternative to clean hydrogen for use in process industries. But as you can see, that CCUS with the tax credit is only competitive in a few industries, particularly in ethanol, fertilizer, and gas processing, and still not very competitive in some of the very carbon-intensive industries like cement and iron and steel. And this, I think, further underscores the need for looking at very seriously at hydrogen as an alternative for those industries. And then the last slide I want to show here in terms of this sort of overview of hydrogen is the current investment levels in innovation. And if you go back 15 years ago, the US was the largest investor in hydrogen R&D, comprised about half of the global investment. And as you look at what's happened over the last 15 years, we've dropped from half to less than 20% of the global hydrogen innovation budget. And our total spending has probably dropped now down to less than 100 million from well over 400 million. So just to kind of wrap this up here, I would like to flip on to the next slide, which shows, if we can move to the next slide, please. One idea that we've been working on at EFI is the notion of a hydrogen hub, which is a way to deploy the hydrogen economy. And this is an example of a kind of a Southern California West Coast hydrogen hub, where two steam methane reforming plants and several electrolyzer plants can supply the hydrogen needed for petroleum refining, port facilities, and for some power generation, with nearby sequestration of CCUS. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'd like to flip to the very last slide, if I could, please, and just kind of summarize for you what I think there's some of the issues to think about in terms of policy development and market development. Obviously, any form of economy-wide decarbonization policy would set market expectations and encourage energy deployment. On the supply side, I think we need to invest in continued innovation to reduce costs, to find new ways to manage the carbon, and also to ensure that we have a compatible infrastructure in pipelines and turbines. But we really see the need here is for market development through ways to create market pull incentives, whether there are for vehicle standards, blending standards, market design and electricity peaking requirements, or procurement standards. And last but not least, then we need business model innovation to think about ways to produce hydrogen, not only for fuels, but for electricity and also for products. And we think that the partnership idea to develop hydrogen hubs is the way in which to bring all of this together. And so with that, I'll kind of end here and turn the presentation back to Peter.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. That was very insightful and very helpful to go through that. Stay on the screen with me, and Bart, if you can turn your video and audio back on and join the conversation for a few minutes with us. Bart, please rejoin. And I would ask, I think the idea of the hydrogen hub, maybe that you just left off on, maybe take a minute or two for each of you to compare how you see things like a hydrogen hub taking place in the European market, and versus in various parts of the U.S., whether it's West Coast or here in the Northeast and where I am, and many of us are. I'm not sure if there's different resources that might take the lead, or whether it's different applications, more around electricity generation or mobility or industrial applications that may be the catalyst for the catalyst from a business model perspective in terms of moving something like that forward. So Bart, any thoughts on that side?
Yeah, well, there are several angles to this. I mean, you know that we're mainly working from the hydrogen valleys. That's the hydrogen hubs that you call in the US, where we call it hydrogen valleys. And depending a little bit on each valley that we will build, the starting point or the reason or the trigger to do it is different. For example, the northern Netherlands, they had this big problem with earthquakes, and because they are extracting a lot of natural gas out of the ground, and the ground is shaking there, and so it cost them enormous amounts of costs to pay all these damages for the houses. So the government has said, look, we stop here with natural gas extraction. We completely stop, and we have to find another, another source of income, because there are 20,000 jobs at stake over there. So that's why they said, okay, we go for hydrogen. We will become the hydrogen supplier of Europe. And that was the reason for the building that hydrogen valley over there. For us also, what is very important to mention, that the hydrogen valley needs to be a sectoral integration approach. So it's about hydrogen production, it's about hydrogen storage, but also immediately use it in trucks and mobility, but also use it in industry. So it has to be a complete sectoral integration, because then it makes most sense to do it. But then, in addition to that, we might also have in the ports area. Europe is very much looking into big ports. We have Rotterdam port, the Antwerp port, we have quite Hamburg port. What we see in those ports, a lot of big industrial players are there. Many times it's also chemical players, chemical industry, and they need a lot of hydrogen. So we will look very much also into working together a bit with the port authorities to put in their big hydrogen production facilities for decarbonizing mainly the industry, but at the same time it will also be used for the maritime. And the maritime, they can use hydrogen or even let's say ammonia, which is also need hydrogen as a starting point. So for this kind of activities, we see that maritime can help us as well. So, and at the end, so if we will build this kind of hydrogen valleys around Europe, we will be able to connect them through infrastructure.
Very interesting, thanks. And Joe, maybe for you to follow on that, do you see some of these, the hydrogen hubs and hydrogen valleys also leveraging some of the applications and industry interfaces through ports?
Absolutely, and I'd like to just underscore the points that Bart made. In our thinking about hydrogen hubs, and again, I made this point early on, but I want to reiterate that historically in the US, we've always thought of hydrogen in connection with transportation, and specifically in connection with fuel cell technology. And what we are now thinking is informing the market for hydrogen. We need to think about the other applications and things like chemicals, refining, port facilities, peak power generation, all have the potential to create the market at scale that's really needed to encourage hydrogen production. We know how to produce hydrogen. We obviously want to be able to continue to innovate to reduce the cost of production, but what we really need to do is focus now on the market development. And I think in terms of thinking about this, we need to look at regions like we picked this Southern California region that's had this sort of combination of these markets. And I think there may be opportunities as well to look at more closely in New England to see where one could begin to create a kind of a hydrogen hub.
Maybe if I can also add to here, Peter, if you don't mind.
We just have a quick moment, but yes, go ahead, Bart.
Yeah, we also see that some coal regions now, for their transition, now also start to look into hydrogen. And for example, we have a coal region in Slovenia who provides 30% of all the energy for Slovenia. Now they say, okay, what our next step is now to transfer to hydrogen and creating basically jobs for those people. So again, the starting point, why they go to hydrogen from region to region is different.
I think this is very helpful, and there's so much more to be asking both of you, but I think we're going to transition actually to our counterparts in the panel, which coming up, which I'm sure is an opportunity to follow exactly on the stage that you've set. So Joe and Bart, thank you both very much for a great kickoff and actually being able to frame the opportunity, both from learning from Europe and from the US. And it makes such a strong case for why we're spending time looking at the opportunities for a hydrogen economy. Thank you both very much. And I'm now going to turn it over to Alistair Pym, my colleague from NECEC, who's going to introduce the next part of the session, our panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Joe and Bart. Very good start to the day. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alistair Pym, Vice President for Innovation and Partnerships at NECEC, and I'll be moderating the panel. And while I'm introducing this, if the panelists could just be ready for my signal to turn on their video and audio. But as we've heard from Peter, Bart, and Joe, great strides are being made in other parts of the world defining the role that green hydrogen must play to help us meet our greenhouse emission reduction goals over there. But as I prepared for this event, I learned that many state agencies here in the Northeast are analyzing how they are going to meet their goals and are keen to understand if green hydrogen can play a role. So what I learned was that they want to know what's working, what's not, what could be feasible here, maybe when as well, and if it'll be affordable. So in this panel, we're going to explore these questions and see if we can build on the great work that's been done in the region in the past and continue to chart a pathway for hydrogen in the Northeast. So with that, we have a terrific speaker lineup. But before I introduce them, I'd just like to remind everyone again that we will take some questions after the panel, about a quarter of an hour before the end. And please put all your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. That's where I'll be looking at the end. So please use that box. So if the panelists could now switch their videos on, and I will introduce the panel. Let me just make sure I've got everyone there. Yep. Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. So it's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Katie Dykes, who leads the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, with roles on the White House staff, chairing the board of directors for RGGI, or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and at PURA, the electrical regulator in Connecticut. She's well placed to help us understand what state officials are thinking in the region. She's joined by Matthew Blees, who is the Global Hydrogen Product Manager at Shell, who's deeply involved in Shell's transition to new energies, working on projects around the world and developing Shell's toolkit for hydrogen so he can tell us what's working and what isn't. And then we have Roger Cranenberg, VP of Energy Strategy and Policy at Eversource Energy, one of the local electric and gas utilities in the region, who holds the crystal ball for them, looking out into the future to steer the utility through the energy transition. And finally, Lydia Lee, who's an investment professional at Generate Capital, who Jigar Shah described as his expert on hydrogen. So we're glad to have her here with us today. And she can help us understand this from a finance perspective. So I'd like to start by asking Commissioner Dykes to answer the first question. What I'd like to do is ask each of you to explain in turn, just introduce yourselves a bit more and explain sort of how you're connected to the hydrogen, or this emerging hydrogen economy. So if I could start, please, with Commissioner Dykes.
Well, good morning. It's great to be with you this morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel. It's really exciting to join today during Climate Week and talk about innovation and the types of new technology that we think can solve a lot of challenges that we have and provide some opportunity for improving the reliable integration of renewables. That's certainly something that is of great interest here in Connecticut, as we have been part of frankly, a lot of Northeast states' momentum in securing contracts for offshore wind. For example, I believe up to 4,600 megawatts has been contracted to date between Connecticut and other Northeast states. And we are excited about the scale of renewable generation that's deployment that's possible with offshore wind, complementing investments that we've been making for years in resources like solar and land-based wind. We know that those are intermittent resources, raising a lot of questions about how to reliably and cost-effectively integrate those resources into the grid. Obviously, hydrogen provides a dispatchable opportunity to balance those renewables. So it's something of great interest across the Northeast, but particularly here in Connecticut, where we have been the home of the fuel cell industry for many years. And so certainly, I think we are unique among many states in having programs that have supported the deployment of fuel cells, whether it's front of meter procurements that have been conducted by our department, as well as behind the meter procurements as well through our LREC-ZREC program. Those deployments have primarily been natural gas powered. And so the opportunity to see our fuel cell industry transition to fully clean generation and provide that value in terms of balancing renewables, I think is a really exciting one. And then I would also say, similarly on the transportation side, we've been providing for incentives for fuel cell EVs for some years. I know, of course, the sticker prices have been probably beyond reach in terms of seeing any scale of deployment there, but we continue to provide for that as an important part of our policy framework here in the state.
That's great. Thank you, Commissioner. And I'll come back to you in a second. Matthew, if you'd like to go next, please.
Great. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, hydrogen has been the fuel of the future, and it always will be, is the problem that we keep hearing, right? And so then why is this time different? What we're seeing globally is that there's a perfect storm between getting really serious about decarbonization and all of the different use cases running up against the challenges and what it means to decarbonize. So when we talk about decarbonization, there's a lot of talk about electrification, but the reality is that there's a number of use cases where that just doesn't work. Right? We think about mining, we think about aircraft, we think about peaking plants in many ways. We think about high capacity use cases like, say, taxis, right, where they need to be on the road all the time, or heavy duty trucks, heating, right? So there's a number of use cases here where it's very clear to us globally at Shell that you need a green electron and a green molecule to fully decarbonize. So we're very much focused on the intersection between renewable power, renewable sources of gas like RNG, CCS, and then the markets that already exist. And we think hydrogen is a good way to tie those together. It's pretty interesting, right? Just like an electron, when you make a fuel like hydrogen, you can put that into a car, you can heat your house, you can power use the offset some of the carbon emitting catalysts you see in steel and other places like that, but then also mobility, the same molecule. So for us, there's also a point there where you can connect a lot of these different commodities. These liquid markets and commodities now become common with hydrogen and electricity. So we see it as very much enabling. Where I personally focus on is the realities that we find ourselves today. So where we find ourselves today is hydrogen is expensive, it's unreliable in many ways, it's not ubiquitous, and the capability to deploy this is not common. The standards are there, there's a lot of great global standardization, the safety is there, the technologies are there, but now what we have to do is scale. We have to firm these supply chains, reduce cost, improve reliability, improve customer experience, and that's where I focus on. And we see it within striking distance. So we see that this time around is very much different. There's a lot of public support. There's a lot of policy support. The technologies are ready, and we see commercial products coming to market. And where I focus on is to assist those companies that want to get to market to fill those gaps in the supply chain. So we're very bullish on hydrogen, and we see a lot of year by year, we see doubling of things like doubling performance, halving of cost, huge announcements being made. So we're very positive on where this is going in the next 5 to 10 years.
Sounds like a lot to do, but you're taking on the challenge. That's great. We'll come back with some questions in a minute, Matthew. So Roger, if you could just elaborate on what you do at Eversource and how you're connected to hydrogen.
Alistair, as you put it, I hold a crystal ball and I'm trying to not drop it and break it. So what I do at Eversource is I have the privilege of focusing on the long term. I think one of the things that folks that I talk to throughout the region, and I'm new to the region, one thing we can all agree on is the objective is deep decarbonization. It's net zero by 2050. As a company, we've also made an internal commitment to be net zero by 2030 for our operations. So that's the objective, and that's what I focus on and might I add, we're also a water utility. And very much what I would call deep regional. So a lot of what I spent my time on when I came here was decarbonizing electric generation. And our plays in that, facilitating solar, offshore wind, and then spending a lot of time, I run the transportation electrification program, and I'm a full-blown car guy, so focusing on that. One thing I've struggled with, to be quite honest, when I moved here, I grew up in Texas, so you can hold that against me or not, but it's a cold climate. It's a very cold climate, and you get severe cold snaps. And I could sort of see my way through decarbonizing generation. I could see my way through decarbonizing transportation much, much harder, but I could sort of see my way through it up until you get to the high end, like 18-wheelers. Heat, I struggled with, and I continue to struggle with. So I've been spending a lot more of my time looking at how do you provide heat in a cold climate like New England. And the conclusions I arrived to is, don't look to California, definitely don't look to Texas. If you're going to look for leadership, look to Europe. And Alistair, I think you had asked me this question, when did hydrogen come on your radar? And I think you said, 6 years ago, and it came up through a former colleague of mine. She's English, a Cambridge graduate, brilliant woman. She'd started looking at this 6+ years ago on how do you provide heat for Europe, and she was sort of walking down those paths. So that's kind of the overview. Fitting into what Matthew said, you're looking at what's going on in the global market. I tend to sort of separate the two. The global market is driving technology innovation, which spreads globally very readily. Think solar, think onshore wind. Our role in this region is how do you get scale of the application regionally? And how do you provide all the services that society is used to, deserves around staying warm, portable, safety and health, resiliency? How do you provide all of those, accepting the fact you live in a cold region? And part of fitting together with what Matthew said, I spent some time in telecom, and one of the things you realize if you look at any transportation network, that the last mile is very, very valuable. So currently in our gas distribution system, we're distributing natural gas. If we're going to achieve deep decarbonization, that has to change, it has to transition, it has to evolve. However, and I think Joe mentioned this in the EFI work, that's not an option you want to eliminate right now. That's a valuable transportation network that you have to figure out how to evolve. And I think of the analogy to telecom of, when we were going towards broadband, we didn't abandon our twisted copper pair. We leveraged it to get us DSL, and then sort of work from there. And we're still in that transition, to be quite honest. I have fiber to my house. I'm very fortunate. Most of the population still uses DSL for broadband. So I emphasize that to say, these are transportation networks that we've got to figure out how to evolve, et cetera. And some of the questions that came up when Joe was speaking is, obviously resiliency, we can talk about that. But this is an open question in my mind. I don't know the answer, but one of the questions that comes to mind is the policy environment and our legal environment, et cetera, structured to facilitate this deep decarbonization future? I think what you heard from a lot of folks is you're starting to see a lot of need to do cross-sector work, gas to electric to transport to efficiency. Is our legal and regulatory structure such to facilitate and allow that? So those are some of the things I think through and some of the things I've focused on. I can talk more about the application of hydrogen and where it's at. It's less of an industry issue in this region, and it's more of heat and generation and things like that.
It's a great thing to think about, Roger, and we'll definitely come back around on some of the questions you raised. So finally, Lydia, if you could explain your role at Generate Capital and how you're involved in the hydrogen industry.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Lydia. I'm an investment professional at Generate. And for those of you who don't know Generate, we're a company that builds, finances, owns, and operates sustainable infrastructure and clean energy projects. We cover a variety of sectors. We cover a variety of sectors, including solar, storage, transport, and waste to value. And here at Generate, my primary role is to originate and execute on deals in the fuel cell and hydrogen sector. We have invested in various types of fuel cell projects, both from the mobility side as well as stationary generation applications. And we're also actively seeking opportunities to finance hydrogen infrastructure and hydrogen midstream projects. So Generate, as an investor, we offer very flexible financing solutions, and we typically work pretty closely with our partners to find the right structure for each different deal. And we're willing to take more risks than traditional financiers in the clean energy space. This allows us to really consider new technologies or new applications, especially things that haven't found their way to raise capital from traditional financiers. So hydrogen is definitely one of those verticals that fall under this category. And we hope to really become a pioneer or what I'd like to call an enabler for more hydrogen projects to be financed. And we also help these development partners to become more institutionalized. We help them to really understand what project financiers typically look for and help them quote unquote grow up to be one of those categories that can get the plain vanilla 3% cost of capital in the future. So that's what I focus on a daily basis, and very happy to be on the panel and discuss these topics with everybody here.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks to all the panelists. That's great. So I'd like to go back to you, Commissioner Dykes, and just I heard that you're you're supporting the governor with the Council on Climate Change, so bringing in all the stakeholders, trying to figure out how you're going to meet the goals. So you sort of hinted at some of that, and you're obviously starting to think about hydrogen, but I noticed that you were due to sort of share some reports today. So do you have any new news on what you're thinking about and of how the energy mix is going to look, and if there's any role for hydrogen there?
Sure. So, so we've been working for quite a while now with the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which was just kicked off last September. So we're coming up on a year. And the governor directed DEEP as part of that council process to also look at pathways to reach a 100% zero carbon electric grid by 2040. So finding cost-effective ways to not just ensure that we're meeting that 100% clean grid on an average annual load basis, right? The way that our RPS is currently calculated, but really trying to actually meet resource adequacy 24/7 as much as possible with zero carbon resources. I think it's going to be really necessary for us to achieve our carbon targets. And so that's where we have to be really laser focused on things like transmission, build out and integration, storage, and hydrogen as well, for that balancing resource attribute. And I think one of the advantages that we have in the Northeast is that we do have a lot of states surrounding us who have similar goals. I think that's really positive. There's a lot of modeling that's been going on in Massachusetts, for example, around meeting ambitious decarbonization goals for 2050. Rhode Island, New York, others, even Maine now, looking at meeting these types of goals. And in the Northeast, of course, we have a lot of density. So, the fact that we have such a significant amount of our load in our regional New England grid concentrated in the southern New England region, I think will provide for some positive a positive environment, not just from policy, but from the infrastructure standpoint, as we think about the delivery infrastructure necessary to really leverage a move towards hydrogen. So I think those are some positive attributes. Our planning processes certainly are focused on this. Ultimately, though, I think we do need to see at the federal level a commitment to addressing decarbonization in order to unlock the scale of subsidy and support. I think that's going to be needed to really jumpstart a lot of this infrastructure build out. And we'll see where that goes. But I think to the extent that we can see that, federal support paired with a really positive environment, both in terms of infrastructure and policy at the state level, I think that means that the Northeast and Connecticut are going to be really posed to be a great place for this to take off.
That's great, Commissioner. So you mentioned there a sort of role for hydrogen as like a balancing resource. So that sounds like to me like a sort of replacement for a natural gas peaker plant. Is that how you view it, or is it some other way of thinking about hydrogen?
Yeah, I think that's one application that would certainly be one that we'd be looking at. I think, even in terms of the I think that there's a lot of different applications for it, but certainly that is the one that seems the most near at hand as we think about the integration of significant thousands of megawatts of offshore wind, for example, into the region's grid.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn to Matthew now, and I'll come back later on for some other questions for you. But so. Matthew, you've heard what the Commissioner said, but you also started talking about some of the other applications that you're seeing around the world. And you heard what Joe Hisha said about some of the uses he sees here. So, with your knowledge of what's working with what you're developing, as you said, seeing better performance, better cost, how do you look at the Northeast and how do you see it playing a role?
Yeah, and it's actually interesting, the hub that was described in that page, we're already actually starting to build it out organically. We've just finished commissioning 2 heavy-duty refuelers in the Port of Los Angeles that are fueling drayage trucks that are driving freight from the port into the inland empire in LA. There's electrolysis being built there. There's dispatchable resources being converted to hydrogen. There's we just announced another 51 stations being developed there for refueling. So it's happening organically, and really it could certainly benefit from acceleration. But I think from what does that mean for the Northeast? the way I think about hydrogen is that it's not helpful to think about all the things it could be, because technically speaking, it could do everything, therefore it's nothing, right? It's, if we focus on too much that it could do, we should really be focusing on the things that it is exclusively tailored to do. And so, and then back away from there. So I think about the question of hydrogen or non-hydrogen. Well, how are we going to be powering our long haul 40-ton trucks that are driving in and out of the state? How are we going to be decarbonizing our heating, right? It's not going to be done all through electrical means, right? And then think about imports. We have trouble bringing in power from Quebec. You saw on the graph there presented by Joseph as well, that energy imports from Quebec is an important part of that. Well, it's a tough time building high voltage transmission lines, but we can repurpose pipelines. So it's about energy, right? Bringing in energy into New England, I think, has some similar challenges to Europe. Europe is very much focused on, they're saying, yes, we know hydrogen has to be part of this. Yes, we know we need more renewable resources, but we don't have all the energy we consume here. We can't put enough wind in, we can't put enough solar, and we have to import the energy. And then yet again, that's where hydrogen plays a role, energy imports. It's a heck of a lot easier to import a molecule than it is an electron. And so when you combine all those things together, I think it starts to form that, where's that thin entering wedge to start from? I would say let's start from the hard to decarbonize places and then see where it goes. So there's certain cases where it's clear that pure electrification is not going to work. So I think I would start there. And then what we found, at least in, certainly in China and certainly in Western Europe, is that when you start there, all of the other knock-on effects of how volume drops costs and how, where it's a toss-up between different ways you could serve the customer, the volume and scalability of hydrogen is it's just huge, right? So it's hard to start, but it's very easy to scale because it scales like natural gas, and we know how to scale natural gas.
That's helpful, thank you. So Roger, when you were talking earlier, it sounded sort of very similar. You talked about how hydrogen could help with heavy transport and also heat. But you also talked about resilience, right? So when you think resilience, can you elaborate on that? What are you thinking, and how do you see maybe hydrogen playing a role as a resilience strategy?
Yeah.
We can't hear you, Roger. I don't know what happened there, but your audio's gone.
Can you hear?
That's better. Okay. But you have to speak up. We can't hear you very well. Matt? I don't know what happened, but we've lost your audio there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. I'm not sure what happened. Okay, so when I think resiliency, and this really come to the forefront of many people's minds, including myself, in COVID. And we've experienced this ourselves. So in the drive to efficiency, you can actually hurt resiliency, your ability to adapt to the unknown. And COVID brought to the forefront, there's a lot of unknowns in our society. And then specifically to resiliency for energy, you see this in the Gulf Coast, you see this in any energy system, you see this within electricity. Diversity is your friend. And to your question, resiliency of the energy sector and its reliance on the gas transportation network plays out in ways where many of our backup generation facilities uses that gas system. So fire stations, police stations, hospitals, universities, schools, you just drive around, you'll see these backup generation facilities, telecom, data centers, those all rely on the existing, what's distributing natural gas, with that transportation system for resiliency. So I think that's a very, very important point. It's tough to price. It's tough to put a number on. Data centers probably do the best job because they have to make an obligation for 11.9s or whatever, and they realize in doing that they just can't focus on reliability of the computers, because if they don't have power, it's not going to do anything. And so that's something that's really come front of mind for me. That ties into some of the things that you would think Matthew and I were the best of friends in some of our comments, but I think of, if you look at a global picture, what's relevant for New England and what's really comes to the forefront in terms of the tough to electrify sectors is heat. It's things like heavy transport, 18-wheelers. I don't see, and I'm a big electric vehicle fan. Personally, I don't see an electric 18-wheeler. So things like that. Other sort of oddities of this region of commuter rails are all diesel electric. That would be a good application for hydrogen. Displacing forklifts that are currently gray hydrogen to green hydrogens. There's some of those opportunities. But back to your original question, resiliency is having diversity and having the ability to, okay, for whatever reason, this system isn't working, and you see this a lot in space, etc. Instead of obsessing about making that work, you have a backup, you have an alternative. You see this in cybersecurity as well.
So I have a question, because I'm an engineer, so I just want to understand this, right? So what you're suggesting, I think, is pump hydrogen down a natural gas pipeline and then burn it in something like a combined heat and power plant, right?
Right.
So can that be done? So question back to Matthew, are there any limitations there? Do things have to be changed, or is it just a drop in fuel that can replace natural gas?
A great, absolutely, you can drop in directly into the natural gas grid right now. It depends, you have to analyze the piping and whatnot, depending on what the materials are and look at the valves. But from what I've seen, anywhere between 5 to 20%, depending on the construction of the pipe. Depending on what pressure rating, you can drop the pressure rating as well, but you can do between 5 and 20% today with no modification, or very little modification. So if you think about what that means, we think about, well, look how long it's taken us to decarbonize our grid, power grid, and it's still ongoing. And what we're saying is, in a very short time, we can cut our emissions on anything that goes through a pipeline between 5 and 20%. Right, so that's huge. That's scaling. That's what I'm talking about in terms of scale, and it really just takes a decision to do it. So when you look at the costs too, there's a good reason why costs are high, because it's fractions of a percent of market share that hydrogen occupies right now. But if there was a decision to say, we're going to create a green content requirement in pipelines, which I'm sure that Roger's now no longer my best friend by saying that, but if there's policy that drives that, the costs come down dramatically through the ability for us to invest in scaled production. So that's just an example of, and then if you have to go to 100% hydrogen, there are retrofit options, new build options. You can talk about reusing the right of way that you already have on the pipe, doing pipe in pipe. There's coatings. There are things you can do, but again, these things are manageable, right? There are hydrogen pipelines today. In fact, some of our stations in LA and San Francisco run on hydrogen pipelines that run under the street today. So it's a reality, and same with in Northern Holland and around Rotterdam area and Amsterdam, we have hydrogen pipelines delivering hydrogen to customers today. So it's doable.
That's good to hear. Okay, good. So then it comes to a question of how much does it cost? So I think we should turn to Lydia. So everyone's talking about does hydrogen have to be cost competitive with natural gas? But is that where we should start, or are there other applications now which make more sense, Lydia?
Yeah, I would say in order to reach 100% or net zero, obviously we have to make it competitive, but we're not there yet. So the current step is what we call the beachhead market. Find the verticals where you are creating a lot more value for the customers who are willing to pay a higher price for hydrogen. And here are some examples that I'd like to share just to give you some ideas of what could potentially be in that beachhead concept. First one is for material handling vehicles, or what we call the forklifts. There are a couple providers or vendors of forklifts, Plug Power being one of them. So compared to battery-powered forklifts, these units actually have very different characteristics that allow the customers to be willing to pay more for hydrogen. First of all, they take much shorter time to refuel. And as a distribution center for Amazon or Walmart, obviously they wanted to run on 24/7 every day and do not lose any time trying to refill their forklifts. And additionally, for battery-powered forklifts, you have to store up a lot of batteries in your distribution center that takes the footprint where you can actually put your materials or goods there. So for hydrogen, you are saving about a quarter to a third of the footprint in a distribution center that creates extra value for the customers. And additionally, because some of these customers are large Fortune 500 companies that also have their own carbon emission reduction goals, and using hydrogen forklifts help them to make a very big step toward reaching their goals. Comparing all of the different benefits of hydrogen forklifts, basically the conclusion is for these customers, they really are willing to pay more for the hydrogen powered forklifts compared to other applications or natural gas powered vehicles. So this is a beachhead market where we don't really have to care about how cheap we can get the hydrogen to be. And there are customers who can afford this. Obviously, it's a very small scale compared to the overall hydrogen market, but this is how we can enable the breakthrough and get it started with. So in addition to forklifts, we're also looking at applications at data centers. And data center operators care very much about having the power to be super reliable. They can't afford any shutoffs. They can't really afford being on the grid and subject to weather events or grid events. So this is another application where people really are willing to pay more for a hydrogen microgrid or hydrogen to power and power to hydrogen combination to make sure that they have 24/7 power to support their critical load. And for some data centers, they're even willing to switch to green power and green hydrogen because, again, of different types of goals that these companies committed to, or they just wanted to pioneer the application of power to gas with renewables. And the last one I wanted to mention is microgrid for small C&I customers. These customers might be grocery stores, might be some mom and pop shops in different areas. For this scale, natural gas is not necessarily much more competitive because you still have to pay a lot of variable costs in the setup cost installation. So if you're at a scale that is not utility scale, the cost of natural gas versus the cost of hydrogen doesn't really make as much of a difference for these people. And many of them are much more sustainability oriented, and they wanted to make all the power that they generate to be green and on their own off-grid applications. So for them, there also is the option of using hydrogen fuel cells to power what they have. Especially if they're already located close to a filling station, they can pretty much get hydrogen supplied by existing infrastructure.
So a quick clarifying question, Lydia. You said data centers there. So I know Bloom is known for supplying fuel cells to some data centers, and they've announced recently that they are looking to produce a hydrogen-powered fuel cell. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Bloom is definitely a leader in natural gas fuel cells. And as Matthew mentioned, a lot of natural gas infrastructure or even natural gas fuel cells can be retrofitted or re-engineered to be hydrogen fuel cells in the future relatively easily. So with the fleet that Bloom operates today, we can see sometime in the future, they have the ability to switch to hydrogen and power those fleet that they already have.
That's great.
And I could just add that, as again, Connecticut qualifies fuel cells currently, natural gas fired fuel cells as class 1 renewables through that, again, reflecting the importance of the fuel cell industry in our state. And we've seen a lot of interest and uptake from commercial industrial customers for fuel cells precisely because of the value that they place on reliability and having on-site power that's 24/7. And so I think that as we see, a scale up in the availability of hydrogen, certainly, and those price points coming down, as well as the refinement of the fuel cell technologies and the delivery systems for hydrogen, I think we'll continue to see C&I customers as an important base for the deployment of these fuel cells for that reliability need.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Commissioner. So I'll come back to you with another question. Actually, I mean, you've talked about various sort of roles for government in this in helping this market emerge, right? So you talked about setting goals. You talked about encouraging innovation. But I wonder, if you go back to your role as chair of the board of RGGI, how do you see sort of collaborating with the other states to encourage this? Well, if you all decide that hydrogen should play a role, how do you see the role of government across the region helping to do that?
Well, I do think that, there are a variety of different attributes that are going to be really important for reaching a deeply decarbonized society and an economy. And that, up till now, I think the states have primarily in the design of our sort of core mechanisms for achieving decarbonization have been focused on the environmental attribute, the actual emissions reduction aspect. And you see that reflected in the design of RGGI, which focuses on capping and trading emissions, CO2 emissions allowances. You see that in our RPSs that are focused on, the actual megawatt hour production of clean or zero carbon energy. But there are other attributes that are going to be increasingly important to achieve that deep decarbonization. And meeting resilience and reliability, or resource adequacy is another way to reference that, being able to ensure the availability of the zero carbon resource on a base load or a 24/7 or a dispatchable basis is going to be very, very important for meeting these goals. And so I think that increasingly, finding those opportunities to design markets, especially on a regional basis, where we can get the most efficient deployment around those resilience and resource adequacy attributes combined with our zero carbon attributes, I think is going to be really essential to be able to scale up the kinds of investments that we need in things like hydrogen that will help to integrate our intermittent zero carbon resources.
That's great. Thank you. So Roger, I'd like to turn back to you. You hinted earlier that now you are an electric and gas utility, but you see lots of reasons for having more integration, and you hinted at the need for new governance models. So can you elaborate a bit on that and help us imagine what you think what the future might look like for Eversource and other utilities, and how regulation might look in years to come?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I raised more questions than answers in that realm. And some of the things, we've sort of stumbled working through, energy efficiency, as most people on this know, a lot of that's been had through electric energy efficiency, light bulbs and etc. But, we're starting to go deeper and deeper into sort of the heat sector. How do you make homes more energy efficient, more insulation, and we're getting through that in terms of the policy, etc. And in our EV work, it's come up of how do you drive incentives for EVs through the electric system, where the benefits really coming from decarbonizing transportation. I had a discussion with McKinsey, and we were talking about the future of the gas business, and what kept coming up more and more is, and this is the way consumers think of things, is what the consumers are really interested in is staying warm and staying safe and healthy. How to get there, it's kind of, as my wife would say, your problem. But then it brings in if we're going to go electrify, and most of the heat's currently provided in gas, is the environment such that you could provide the incentives to make that switch and transition? And it just keeps coming up over and over. In terms of Eversource as a company, I would call us a deep regional player. So if all this works out, we go towards deep decarbonization, you've got a much more integrated energy system, but you have an energy system that's much less reliant on fossil fuels. And in terms of the regional economic impact, there's a huge positive for it. To the chagrin of my former colleagues and my family in Texas, fossil fuels, the exploration and production is not in New England. The refining is not in New England. We're really good at leveraging it, using it, distributing it, doing all of that. And that plays into a sort of a bigger question that I have, and this dovetails a little bit with some of the stuff that Matthew was saying is, let's start listing the knowns and unknowns in this future. And then let's start, seeing what we can do now and what we shouldn't do now. And in that bucket, I would, put forward, let's not shut down the gas distribution system. It alleviates, and I think Joe touched on this in his presentation, it alleviates a very valuable transportation network and an option that we may really need with all these various uncertain futures. And in terms of economic impact as well, and Katie touched on this, and Matthew sort of schooled me on this, there's a lot of regional companies that would benefit from this transition. Some of the ones, fuel cell energy, they're working with ExxonMobil to do electrolyzers. Doosan, they can run on hydrogen. Matthew mentioned Fibatech that stores hydrogen. And then, the geek that I am, I've started spending a lot of time looking at the technology on the International Space Station and stumbled into the fact that a lot of that manufacturing was done in Connecticut. So you've got a lot of sort of regional advantage that you can really leverage in applying that technology here and developing it here. But then to Matthew's point, and sending it as a global market. So, huge economic benefits in leveraging institutions like UMass, MIT, UConn, Connecticut, world-leading manufacturing, history in space and exploration, aeronautics, and things like that. So I think I went a little bit beyond your question, so I'll shut up now.
No, but it's good. It's good. It helps. And I wanted to actually pass it to you, Matthew, because you talked there, starting to talk about, what have we got as a local supply chain? And I think, Matthew, your expertise is in figuring out, where can you get the supply chain to build something? So if you look around the US, we talked about some of these companies, but are they ready? Are they world class? Would you pick them to build something here, or would you go back to Europe and pick some of the suppliers there? What have we got to do to get ready?
Great question. I do want to answer your question, Alistair, by tying in something that you said, Roger. I think what we have to understand is Europe's gone through this. I mentioned it once earlier, but it's really important to think about and grasp is that New England cannot generate all of the energy it needs for the energy future. And if you think about what the implication of that is that any strategy that we have has to start with where are we getting it from? And that means imports. And I'll say it again, we already have challenges importing the heating that we do, right? We have to already create LNG for capacity in the winter because we can't pipe in as much as we need. It's crazy. Already we have a problem. So now we're going to go with less dense, more distributed resources than we already even have. And so we have an even bigger energy import problem in the future. So consider that, right? And that underpins everything we're discussing here. But then as you start from there and kind of go one step beyond and then another step beyond, it kind of leads you to, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the region and what do we have to then partner? How do we partner to solve that problem? To get to your question, Alistair, is that, so I lead Shell's global, if you think about it, Shell's big, large company. Hydrogen is a very big part of our energy transition goals, right? Huge part, actually. And I have an engineering, product development, supply chain management team located. We're doing work in in China, in Europe, in Canada, in US, and where are we located? Boston. Why? Because this is where the talent is. So unfortunately, over the past 5 to 6 years, that talent has been somewhat de-skilled in these companies that are holding on, right? There's been the companies that we have, there used to be more, many more, right? But the talent is still there, and we've kind of tried to gather and tap into that. So there is not just about, there's a conversation about energy imports we have to talk about, but then conversely, there's a gray matter export. There's a product export. There is a capability export that's waiting to be tapped here, right? These are high quality jobs, high paying jobs. 3 years ago, there was 0. Now there's 30, high paying jobs here in the region focused on this problem in my team, right? That's just one company. What would happen if other companies got on board behind a policy that then we could start to decarbonize with hydrogen and electrification, right? So I think it's right there. It's just like a balloon waiting to pop. And it's tough to do business with these companies here in New England because they're not supported in the way that we need for them to scale with us. So if I look at our supply chain right now, it's mostly out of Germany. And why? Because I can go right to the German government and say, here's a hole in the supply chain. Here's some companies I want to work with. Will you work with us? And within weeks, we've got a deal. It's that easy, because they understand the need to get back on top, right? Germany had the same kind of story as New England, where Germany was heavily invested in hydrogen technologies, and then it fell out of vogue and kind of went, a little dip. They realized their mistake about 18 months ago and had redoubled efforts to make sure that they could stop that brain drain. And we could do the same here if that's something that's important to us.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but we're not Europe. We don't work the same way. The government doesn't function the same way. So my understanding is that we have to sort of create our model of how that would work here. And maybe that's a good question for Lydia, and maybe the commissioner could chip in after that. But if you think about this challenge of supporting innovation and then supporting the scale up, it becomes a finance challenge. And we know that currently we're kind of stymied. So how does private capital step in to fill that gap? And you've mentioned some examples, but maybe you could elaborate on that, Lydia.
Yeah, of course. So there are, I will start from the perspective of what different types of players are in the space, and what's the role of each one of us along that investment chain of a certain technology. So if you look at very early stage technologies, obviously they're first sponsored by research institutes, universities, and largely government grant. So we'll call that, semi-public sector and academia. And then when they graduate from the school, they, a startup emerges, and the startup needs support from venture capital, early stage investors to be able to think through what type of business models really make their real product and commercialize technology. And then they come to people like us, we're project financiers, and say, hey, there's a technology that works. Would you help us finance our first project or our second or pilot commercial scale project where we can demonstrate this can be scaled and this can actually be applied in various different verticals? So for people like us, like I said, we do take a little bit higher risk compared to other project financiers. So we enjoy working with technology vendors that are a little bit less mature. They need a little bit hand holding, but eventually they graduate from Generate to more traditional financiers like large banks and insurance companies that provide project finance solutions. And in addition to these, recently we actually have seen a lot of capital provided by public entities like New York Green Bank and the Connecticut Green Bank. These are the collaboration between private and public sectors, and we find the support from green banks very helpful for us to be able to make a project meet our return thresholds. And on a very different note, for the past, I think, 2 years or so, a lot of large companies started to put aside pockets of money where they call strategic investments or climate fund. Companies like Microsoft and Amazon both did that on the billion-dollar scale. That is a lot of capital, and it is dedicated to help companies in spaces like hydrogen, which we have experienced a little bit of financing challenge. For a company like Microsoft, they can benefit from these investments in multiple different ways in addition to financial return. They can use the hydrogen infrastructure in their own data centers. They can apply hydrogen fuel cells in their distribution centers. A lot of these are an integration of the role of a customer and the role of a financier together to make sure that you understand the whole value chain of how a technology is enabled by capital.
Yeah, and just to follow on there, I think with Amazon, they basically put a huge order to Plug Power, which helped them, gave them some capital to enable them to develop and scale up, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah. Amazon announced a really big deal with Plug Power, and Plug Power being a publicly listed company, they are able to raise more capital from the public market with higher stock price because of these large announcements. So it's a collaboration between the customer as well as investors to make sure that they have the money to produce what the customer wants.
that's great. Okay. So I'm looking at the time, and I actually do want to move now to audience questions. We've got a big bunch of them, and then I will come back to the panelists just for a quick wrap up before we end. But just looking at some of these questions, let me pick one here from Lisa Francis. Not sure this is going to go to, so listen carefully. So if the cost to generate the hydrogen gets closer to $2 a kilo or below, can you comment on the transportation delivery of the hydrogen and technology needed to address any leakage in the pipelines as a result of a lighter fuel? What companies are leaders in addressing coatings within distribution pipelines? And who are leaders trying to address the delivery of hydrogen within the existing pipeline infrastructure? That sounds like mostly a question for Matthew, but maybe others who want to chip in there.
I'll chip in as well.
Roger, why don't you start? You're the pipeline guy.
Yeah, I'm more of a distribution pipeline guy, right? I think it comes back to what I call the knowns and unknowns and sort of evolving into this future. In terms of entities that are best equipped for this, I'm an electrical engineer, applied physics, that kind of world, not a chemistry, chemical engineering guy. So start with that disclaimer. The organization I've found that's best equipped to address some of these questions is GTI, Gas Technology Institute. Pretty well informed of what's the knowns and unknowns. And one of the things I asked them when I chatted with them is, okay, I'm not a gas guy. What do I ask my gas people? What's the question that I ask them? And you know what came out? And Matthew, you mentioned this. Characterize your system. Understand what your system is. What's the pipes that are underground? What are you replacing them with? And then work from there. Because in terms of unknowns, we don't know if the future is going to be distributing pure hydrogen. There's one of the questions in the Q&A that raises, are consumers comfortable with accepting hydrogen? They think Hindenburg. Everyone goes right to that. But to Matthew's point, at an industrial scale, we do it all the time now. And on a professional industrial scale, we know how to do it. It's manageable, but it raises a real question. Should we be also thinking of methanation, which essentially converts the hydrogen, as expensive as it is, into a synthetic methane and distribute it that way? And then the whole pipeline questions sort of get alleviated. What's the optimal trade-off? And then getting back to, with all those unknowns, what are actions we should be taking today to now help us navigate those unknowns in the future, including electrifying heat, use of geothermal. What are actions that we should be taking in the near to midterm to, and this is the engineer in me, reduce the uncertainties to the point where we can, choose a path, so to speak, our paths.
Thank you, Roger. Anyone else want to chip in on that question, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's actually the Roger and companies like Eversource who are to the extent that Roger, you talked about the opportunity and the heating sector for hydrogen. I mean, there are major gaps and I think opportunities for the natural gas distribution utilities to demonstrate prioritization and leadership around addressing leakage. Traditionally, you know, prior to gas utilities being the focus around decarbonization mandates, you know, I think that leakage has only been a concern from the standpoint of safety or loss unaccounted for gas, you know, creating a cost for ratepayers. But the gas distribution system, there are a lot of questions even about the utility's ability to be able to measure how much gas is leaving the system because of a lack of investment in sensors and other types of technology to be able to detect what would otherwise be low volume leaks. And so I think that is a kind of a critical moment today that is facing the gas distribution utilities. Leadership from the distribution utilities around addressing leakage, I think is going to be critical not only for answering questions about what the long-term role of gas distribution infrastructure is in a decarbonized economy, but also for how the distribution system could manage different types of fuels being distributed through those pipes. So, you know, I think that that question is very much in front of us today.
Alice, if I could just respond to that. Katie, absolutely. I mean, my gas group would probably kill me for saying this, but you know, the focus has been safety, et cetera. But if we're going to look, if we truly believe in this deep decarbonization, methane has a very high greenhouse gas component. The other big one is SF6. I mean, that one is crazy stuff. But I mean, to your point, Katie, I would just say absolutely. I totally agree with you.
So I have another question here, which is from Lindsay Delavine. What do we think is needed from New England or Northeast regulators next? As we saw in the European presentation, there are so many areas of government support needed. What might be the next few priorities and what can stakeholders do to inform that process? So perhaps we could start with the Commissioner on that. I'm sure you've already shared a few ideas, but what are your top priorities?
Yeah, I think, again, you know, we are a state that has some of the highest energy costs in the country. So it's, I think I'm proud of the leadership role that our state has played with respect to the fuel cell industry and again, incorporating incentives for fuel cell electric vehicles into our EV incentive program. I think Lydia mentioned our Green Bank, which has really played a critical role to be able to bring together private and public dollars to, again, ensure we can get some deployment of these new technologies and new applications in our state. And also the inclusion of fuel cells in our Class 1, in our RPS, and in our procurement for behind the meter resources through our LREC program. So those are, you know, many of those different elements that we have on the table. I think that perhaps some additional places that we could focus is around, you know, better marketing those incentives to private players that are interested in this opportunity, so that we can kind of help to bring together more of these revenue streams to make some additional scale possible, and hopefully finding perhaps regional mechanisms to value these resources. For example, on the transportation side, we have the Transportation Climate Initiative that Connecticut has been participating in those discussions among many of the Northeast states, and that is a huge opportunity to bring some additional revenue that will support decarbonizing our transportation fleets, I think, and with a lot of flexibility around how those proceeds could be invested. So, we continue to look for opportunities to secure, new types of revenue streams that could support these deployments. And again, hopefully we can get the engine of the federal government behind us as well to unlock some dollars that could stretch these programs even farther.
Thank you, Commissioner. So you mentioned TCI there, but there's another question here, which is, would states, and I think it is a nuance and it's something slightly different, but would states enacting a renewable fuel standard provide a meaningful boost to the transition to hydrogen? So is that a parallel track or a complementary track? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that that could work in complement or in parallel. Honestly, there's many different ways to design mechanisms that can, value the emissions reduction aspects of clean transportation technologies, and at the end of the day, finding the mechanisms that have the most support among ideally many of our neighboring states is really the kind of critical piece, so that we can ensure that we can develop these programs on a regional scale. The TCI program has been one that there's been a lot of leadership and discussion on for many years. Low carbon fuel standards also have been discussed from time to time. In many ways, some of these things can act in complement. So for example, the same way that we have an RPS and RGGI, right? We know that those two programs work in complement with one another. So again, we've got really ambitious carbon targets that we need to tackle. And from our perspective here in Connecticut, finding the pathways that get the most traction among our within our region is really critical.
Thank you. So next question, probably got time for a couple more. From Barry Logue, who I know is part of the UK government. So they're sort of another example of a country that's a step ahead. So are the models for electrolysis, hydrogen generation here accounting for the cost and availability of water? I think it's something we treat as abundant. But for example, can the Mass Water Resource Authority provide enough water to handle a 50 megaton production facility? So any comment on that? Anyone?
I'll jump into it since no so it's responding.
Yeah, so you should know.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a water company. I mean, the honest truth is I don't know the answer to the question at the 50 megaton level. I think one of the benefits the US has is an abundance of resources. At the 50 megaton level, I don't know. I know we have a lot of seawater, but so does the UK. If it has to be fresh water, I don't know. Matthew, do you have a sense on that?
Well, I think that assumes that we're going to make the hydrogen in New England, right? And I get back to why, to get a cost target that makes sense for society, right? We start however we start, but if we're going to get to those $2 levels, the struggle we have, and I think it was Lisa that indicated, transportation delivery, you have to co-locate the generation with the lowest feedstock costs, right? You have to have the lowest input energy possible. You have to have the lowest biogas inputs, waste feedstock inputs possible to even have a chance, right? So we're talking $15 to $20 a megawatt hour, right?
What about offshore wind when it's being curtailed, Matt? We haven't talked about that.
Yeah, so the problem with curtailment is that with an intermittent resource, you're putting in a capital expense that's only used part of the time, and that's a different way of incurring costs, right? So you either incur it in OPEX or CAPEX. And so the struggle here is again, what do we make locally? We'll have resources to make locally, but I think the realization is that there's no way we're going to get to $2 or $3 if with a just focusing on taking curtailment. I think that's a value add. That's not a base load, right? You're not going to displace liquid fuels as a society just doing that. I think there's a lot of value to capturing some of that curtailment, but from an energy basis, it's going to represent a very small percentage of what you actually have to accomplish. So you have to go where the resources are cheap. And then the problem is that people still, that's not where people use the energy. And so we have this import transportation problem that we have to solve in general. So the problem is actually worse because maybe New England has the water, but Colorado doesn't. Right? And all these other places that blow, right? So it is a different challenge. There are solutions to that, right? There are circular economies on water that are being discussed around hydrogen as well. So you make the hydrogen, you use it, there's water, you capture, bring it back, right? So there are other challenges here to solve.
And Matthew, on that one, I mean, I think where you're leading with one of the resources may be Quebec.
Roger, sorry, but we've got just 4 minutes left. So I'd just like to ask you all for a quick wrap-up statement, sort of parting thought for the audience, just before we wrap up. So maybe Roger, since you were talking, I'll let you go first, but maybe sort of 30 seconds to a minute.
Oh, yeah, thanks. So I was just going to comment on Matthew, maybe one of the answers that comes out of your exploration is Quebec has water and has cheap electricity. It's renewable. Who knows? Parting thoughts. Let's focus on the objective, which is deep decarbonization. Let's be very cognizant of the environment we're in. We cannot ignore affordability, equity, resiliency, health and safety. So, I mean, that poses a real challenge because you're trying to do all this stuff, but you can't ignore these very, very present issues in society today. And then, from a very provincial perspective, let's see what's in it for the region. In terms of economic development, that's definitely helped move offshore wind. It's one of the few growth resources the region has. If you look back through the history of power generation, you'll see that it's very much determined by where you're starting from, what your resources are. And overall, let's just start cataloging the knowns and unknowns and get on with it.
Thank you, Roger. Lydia, your final words.
Yeah, so I'd like to say that there are a lot of hydrogen projects or ideas or technologies that are being developed. If anybody find yourself at a place where you think, I have something that is ready to be deployed, but I don't really know who can finance it, who can sponsor it, we're here to really hear out everybody's ideas. And we totally understand that many of the projects we see might not be ready, this moment today, but it could be very interesting down the road in 3-5 years. So we're putting all the effort today to make sure that everybody can get there when they need to. And from that perspective, very happy to collaborate with anybody who wants to elaborate on where the sector is going, what type of opportunities we can work on together.
Thank you, Lydia. And final, Matthew, I think, before the commissioner.
I'll be quick. Just two things. One, customers want to, society wants to decarbonize. They don't care about the technology. They just want to decarbonize. So having a technology agnostic policy and conversation is important, right? I think about lowest cost to decarbonize should be what drives our discussions, not batteries, not fuel cells, not this kind of stuff. It's in this situation, in this case, in Boston might have a different answer than New York, than so forth, and it will. What's the lowest cost to decarbonize? And that's how I view hydrogen, as playing with others as well. So that's really, we shouldn't lose sight of that goal. To be pushing a technology agenda, we should be pushing a lowest cost to society agenda to decarbonize.
Thank you. And final word from the commissioner.
And I'll build off that one to say that at the same time, we need to ensure that attributes like resilience and reliability and adequacy of resources are reflected in our carbon policies, so that, again, those are things that the average consumer or business owner isn't necessarily going to be thinking about. But if our programs, if our markets are not valuing those attributes, then we aren't going to meet our decarbonization goals. And so I think that again, beginning to bring those attributes in to the design of our programs will ensure that resources like storage, hydrogen, et cetera, we'll be able to see some scale. And I think that's a great thing for Connecticut, especially as a home for the fuel cell industry.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Yep. Right. Well, if we could turn to sharing the slides, I want to thank the panelists for a great discussion, lots of thoughts to leave us with. And remember that NECEC can help continue that discussion in our working groups. And as someone asked, how can the stakeholders get involved? Well, you can be part of those working groups to continue the discussion as the states figure out those policies and programs. So we have a couple of upcoming events, which I just wanted to touch on. First of all, when it comes to innovation, we have our Cleantech Open Accelerator in the Northeast has their regional finals next week, October 1st. It's a great occasion to see the latest cohort of innovations coming through the program. And it's a fun evening. So please look out for that on our events page. And then we're running a back to work challenge at the moment, post-pandemic, encouraging our members to submit examples of where they've innovated, whether it be in technology or process or new rules, new permitting rules, etc., to get back to work quick. And we've had some really interesting discussions already, but we have our final event with awards on November the 12th. So all of that information can be found on our events page. And next slide, please. I think it's the final one saying thank you. So thanks again to our panelists. Really appreciate you taking the time today to share all your thoughts with us. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and thank you too for our Fields Associate team for all the event logistics behind the scenes. And we look forward to continuing this and other discussions as we all strive to build a clean energy future. Thank you very much and farewell.